Hey there, PinPoint players. Tim here with the PinPoint Players podcast and my buddy Ramsay.
What's up, guys?
Thank you for tuning in once again. We are charging through with our season 2, and we're covering the 5th episode of the documentary series on Netflix, Highscore.
Today's episode is Fight. And every single time I hear the word fight, I always think of Mortal Kombat, which, coincidentally, is in this episode. Another good episode. I liked it. This one, at least from the 5 I've seen so far, it was not my favorite. Not saying it as a bad thing, but saying, I still love the 4th episode. The guy narrating it, Akira Nishitani, talking about the idea of immersion being key and I think he was getting at Street Fighter specifically.
I actually completely agree with what he was saying. The key element that video games really introduced into the market was immersion. It was getting the player actively involved with the medium. It wasn't really lacking. It was sort of held back at the time by the development and the software, but immersion to the point where it was feeling more real. The things that players contributed to video games was bringing themselves into the character as opposed to bringing the world into the video game.
Definitely very indicative of the time, because you did have characters in video games, but they were kind of very basic. I mean, yes, you did have, Nintendo characters like Link or Samus, Zelda, stuff like that. But given the nature and given how they were designed, 8-bit, maybe 16-bit, if you're lucky, they didn't have that many characteristics and feature sets about them that's, made him, at least at the time, very distinct in the same way like you have a character now. And the man that first starts off talking in the documentary, his first segment, Akira Nishitani, describes, and this I could relate to this, the understanding of this, the refreshing feeling of landing a first punch in a video game to gain the upper hand. He described it as a primitive sensation which compels you to play more, and that's exactly what you described there, Tim.
Exactly, yeah. That first feeling. The feeling came from within the game. It was the sound and the graphics and the combination of the player doing it. But it was that satisfying feeling that the player had that really brought them back to play more. He also went on to say that it was a tough thing for them to introduce Street Fighter 2 because they were sort of developing a game that came out in the late 80s for a mid-90s release. And the thing that they felt like would really draw players in was to immerse the player into the actual world in which the game is played. For a lot of video games at the time, it was sort of fantastical places, space invaders, on a generic city, Dungeons and Dragons in these caves and mysterious, mystical lands.
But it was never anything specific, right?
Exactly. Street Fighter, they brought people to the United States, they brought people to Brazil, they brought people to Japan, obviously, but they also brought people from around the world. I believe it was 8 specific locations to start with.
Right.
Within those 8 places, globally enough, where somebody from any corner of the world could say, hey, they're representing me.
That's the beauty of it. Now, see, full disclosure, disclaimer, whatever. I did play Street Fighter and some fighting games when I was a kid, but I was usually pretty bad at them. I was always intimidated by the button combos. Unless I was playing against another button spammer, I was usually pretty terrible with them. But I always did appreciate the feel that the games, kind of gave off when you landed a punch, but also the backgrounds and just also the general camaraderie you have with the people that you play with, whether they're playing it competitively to kick your ass or they're as bad as you and you're just having a good old time. And that was just something very distinct that I remember with Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat, which we'll get to more of that in a second. But yeah, in the documentary in the first part, I love the description that he kind of talks about when you walk down the streets, and this is how he was getting inspiration for the level design. He walked down the streets looking for inspiration, seeing all the people and the structures. It stimulates the mind, and in his case, he wanted to document it, writing it down with notes, but taking photos, and those photos that he took helped give him that inspiration for the level designs in Street Fighter, and at least in the sequel, I mean. Because he saw the first one, he saw the potential of the first one, because the first one, it was a fighting game, but I think it only had a couple characters in it. I don't think it didn't have the same kind of variety's sake as the second one, and so he wanted to take it further, and the idea of adding these custom backgrounds to make you feel like you're there, especially in all these 8 different countries. It was like you were saying, Tim, that immersion's key. and not just the game you play, but the feeling you get, like pretending as if you're there playing. It's tough to describe, but that
Yeah,
sensation.
it is. That's the beauty of video games, though. It is tough to describe. Something that you mentioned that I actually wanted to bring up, button mashing. That is something I think everyone is familiar with at a certain point in time. There is a game. It's not it's probably Street Fighter for a lot of you. But for me it was Super Smash Brothers
Oh
Melee.
yes,
Fighting games in general, I think that button mashing is an art form. When you don't know what you're doing when you're just first starting to play the game, there's an art form to button mashing, whether it's, expressing your presence of sheer determination to win, you're willing your victory through the buttons. I can't, it's tough to describe, as you said before, but
you do every single trick you can in the book to win,
yeah.
and in your case, the whatever it takes to win. And if you can button mash your way to victory, you're going to do it. And sometimes I can say it worked. And when I was playing Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat, it generally didn't work because those were different types of control games. I will say this, I take back what I said earlier regarding being bad at fighting games. The only fighting game I was actually ever good at was Super Smash Brothers, and I wasn't exceptional. I was probably a middle of the pack, but that to me was a different kind of feeling fighting game. It was fighting game to its nature, but it had its own feel to it that makes it distinct, even almost 25 years after the first one. Good game.
Oh man.
Like
Yeah.
it sucks that a lot of those tournament people kind of ruin the feel of the game. They had to play with no items on these specific levels, but
Mhm.
as a whole, I love that game, and that to me was a good chunk of my middle school years on GameCube when they came out with Melee. But and that's another time. But you get the idea.
Oh yeah, yeah. To really bring out these backgrounds and immersive properties for Street Fighter 2, designer Akira Nishitani hired artist Akira Yasuda. This artist was driven by the fact that most artists of the time, roughly the mid to late 80s, were involved with the manga and anime industry, which wasn't really an artistic form when he started to notice video games. But however, through time, manga and anime became and developed into a very flourished art form. Yasuda wanted to be a part of an involving technology and be a part of the artistry behind it. So he worked for video games and he developed the backgrounds and characters for Street Fighter, which, like I was saying earlier, video games have really become an art form. We may have been just mashing buttons when we were first starting it, but to get a victory was in a way, a sense of an art in its own way. At least I think so.
There was definitely a definite skill set to landing those combos, those hits, to getting that victory. And
Yeah.
in the case of Akira here, with Street Fighter 2, yeah, it's like you were saying, eventually he landed as the artist for Street Fighter 2 because he wanted to be a part of that emerging media. And he said specifically, or said here in the documentary, he wanted to create characters that had a, quote, and this is his word, push. Something memorable where they stood out in their own way, having accents and exaggerating them intentionally and making them stranger and stranger. So you have, Ryu, Chun-Li, Honda, that sumo guy with the really funny makeup and like the really funny kind of underwear garb. You had Guile, which he was an American soldier, ended up being friends with another soldier named Charlie Nash. And he has a freaking American flag tattooed with like giant biceps. I mean, with this like straight top hair, the kind of hair you would have seen guys having back in the 80s, like but overly exaggerated. That was just peak exaggeration, and I love it. But every character had something like that, some exaggerated, awesome kind of funniness about them, and it made it more memorable. Otherwise, it would have just been, I feel like, a generic fighting game that might have lasted a year and then kind of been forgotten by history.
Yeah, it could have very well done, but it ended up being the most successful fighting game of all time, from what I believe the documentary mentioned.
Even still to
And
this day, tournaments still play the game.
yeah, they still do, which is amazing. It just goes to show you that people like Akira, both Nishitani and Yasuda, I've been saying it since day one of this podcast, and if you've been listening, you'll hear, me say it again. The passions that people have really are stronger than we realize. They put the passions into something that they wanted to achieve through the video game. And they done just that. Street Fighter 2 is the most successful fighting game of all time. You see, Yasuda wanted to make memorable characters who became an artistic form, which video games have done. There is an art, I'm going to say it again, there's an art to video games that is hard to describe, but I really truly believe it is an art form.
No, agreed. And one other thing I definitely want to say is a cool shout out with specifically Street Fighter. Yasuda specifically wanted to create Chun Li in the game, like a female character, as a push to get more female players, since there were actually female fighters in kung fu movies, and it was mold breaking at the time, given that most women in games to that point were relegated to generic roles. Your princesses, your damsels in distress. They were kind of just plain as far as what they were until that point. And then you had Chun Li. It's like, nope, she can handle herself, and play as her, and she'll kick all the guys' asses. So in that sense, kudos to them for doing that, especially back in the 80s when, like I said, back then it was video games, back then especially. Today, still so, but especially back then it was kind of more of a guy's world. Like,
Yeah, even in Japan, most arcades were held inside of bathhouses, which a lot of women weren't even allowed to go in and enjoy.
but that speaks to the culture. But even here in the U.S., it's like, yes, there are women developers in gaming and coding, etc., but it's still a male-dominated world. So little things like this that people might not think make much of a difference, they do in the long run. It's better to lay the groundwork than to just not do anything at all and hope it fixes itself later. The last thing, definitely about Street Fighter, because a lot of work went into this game to make it happen, and both Akiras would attend fighting matches to understand the mechanics of fighting, experience the real power and the pain, that these fighters would exhibit on stage, so that way they can emulate it in games. And like you said, in February 91, Street Fighter launched to critical acclaim with those 8 characters, each one with their own killer moves, to huge success. The most popular fighting game ever made, and probably the best selling. I mean, they still play at tournaments, like we said. What we didn't mention, it helped kicked off an arcade renaissance, because arcades were big in the early 80s, and then they didn't disappear entirely like in the US, but they took kind of a back seat for a while. But then when these fighting games came out, like Street Fighter, like Mortal Kombat, and others I'm not naming right now, it helped to kick it off again, and it was amazing for that.
To see an emerging technology like this kind of mirror history, although it's encouraging, there are pitfalls. Every diamond has a scratch, I assume, and the pitfall for this new immersive wave of video games would formulate itself in Midway's Mortal Kombat. With Chung Li making a bridge into video games' immersive qualities, there needed to be something that I think challenged it competitively. And I think that Mortal Kombat, when it came out, sort of did just that. The pioneers behind Mortal Kombat, John Tobias and Ed Boom, sort of wanted to make the same video game using the same mechanics, but what they recognized in Street Fighter is what they wanted to approach, how they wanted to approach it was they recognized Street Fighter as being this fighting game that looks cartoonish and kind of shifty. So what they would do was essentially they would turn it into more of a realistic video game by incorporating real actors, real sets, and most importantly, real kung fu martial artists.
Yeah, they saw the success of Street Fighter 2 and wanted to emulate it as their own gory dream, complete with, button combos with crazy fatalities where you do stuff like decapitate people, rip out their spine. They wanted the whole works behind it, and they wanted something, like you said, less cartoony, more realistic, and the characters that were based off of real life martial artists, but they were digitized. And the timing was perfect as far as the game being developed and came out, because it fit with the timing of the resurgence of fighting movies in the US in the 80s. And it mentioned specifically Jean-Claude Van Damme, and I'm thinking, like
Yeah.
stuff like Bloodsport, that like ridiculous movie. What's unfortunate, and this would have been cool, like just looking at this retroactively, they wanted him in the game, but unfortunately he declined, and it would have just been fun to have Jean-Claude Van Damme
Yeah.
officially in the game, immortalized forever. But he was immortalized anyway, and his fighting moves as Johnny Cage, made it into the final game.
I think it was a real poor decision on Van Damme's part. I'm sure he's kicking himself in the face now, and if he's not, Van Damme, I'm talking to you directly. You done fucked up, okay? All right?
Could have been immortalized forever.
But you have been immortalized forever in this video game in your own sort of unique special way and sort of the creator's unique special way. What I really appreciate about the way that they approached that was they still made him in the game, but they didn't have the permission to use him directly. So instead of saying, "Hey, you can play Jean-Claude Van Damme," they just made a character that he would play. And they were like, yeah, it's totally the dude, you know?
It's totally the guy. We nailed the feel. It's just not called Jean-Claude Van Damme. I think in
Yeah.
the end, they wanted the game overall to be controversial, to get the attention it did get, and it was a hit, regardless. I just want to say on a personal side note, it's really cool that they included this in the documentary, the old behind-the-scenes footage from the early '90s of,
Oh, I
the
agree.
art, the fighters, that were going to be digitized, the places where they would
Yeah.
film the backgrounds, like film the scenes of them doing their kick moves, their jump moves. Kind of cool to see because you wouldn't think to normally go looking for this, and that stuff, unless it's on a YouTube video, is kind of hard to find. So I imagine a lot of that stuff is
Mm.
behind is on some sort of film reel in some sort of like closet somewhere. You never know, and it's
Oh,
not
yeah.
something you see normally.
What I really appreciated about that behind the scenes footage, coming from a filmmaker's perspective, is that the people who were involved looked like they were having fun. I think that's a really important sign in a project because you can look at behind the scenes footage of Lord of the Rings or a Johnny Depp movie, and you can get the feeling of how the people are interacting with each other on the set is how the production is going. When you're with all of those people, if someone's upset, everyone's upset, and you can sense it. You can sense it in the way that they're talking. You can sense it in the way that they hold themselves. So to see the people hired to be the characters in the Mortal Kombat video game joking, laughing, falling into the soft, cushiony things and laughing, it showed me that they had complete trust and confidence that what they were doing was going to be a good thing. Sure, I'm sure that they knew that some of them would have their heads decapitated and it would look gory and violent. But going back into this wanting to be an immersive sort of thing and bringing the world into the video game, there were certain things about life that were eventually going to be needed to be introduced into a video game, and one of those things is violence.
Oh yeah, and to that end, instead of people just accepting it as a normal stage of evolution, because we went from games being a pixel wide for table tennis to at this point digitized people beating the hell out of each other and doing these violent acts to each other. As we've said before, America's natural reaction is to generally freak out first and then kind of accept it later. That is exactly what the United States Congress, specifically the Senate, did. National scrutiny came in about the game from the media. The backlash was actually, they knew there would be some backlash, but it was way worse than they thought. And one guy in the documentary from an old interview back in the 90s made a good point. You fight on a virtual screen rather than actual fisticuffs. So, I mean,
Yes.
and that's the thing. You're just fighting in a game, and that's better than people fighting like after school, 3 o'clock at the flagpole or something. Joe Lieberman was the point man behind it, saying games like Night Trap and Mortal Kombat were basically violence simulators.
The quote that you're looking for, that young man, the exact quote is, "If you can fight in the game, not fight in real life, obviously that is better."
Yes, it's a simple enough quote, but it's entirely 100% true. It's better to like people got into issues about Grand Theft Auto 3 and Vice City that you can kill, like you said in our very first or second episode, that you couldn't rent the game because you can kill cops. It's like, but it's a game.
It's a game.
It.
Yeah.
I mean, I know we can beat that horse to death and everything, but again, with all these, it's a game, and it's better to be done in a game than in real life. And there's been studies since about how it's not a simulator or train people for anything. But I digress because, like I said, we could talk about this for the next 2 hours.
We really could.
But shifting, but shifting back specifically to the Senate hearings, the other game that was under their radar that they were ready to tear a new one was Night Trap, which we also mentioned in the
Yes.
second ever episode. And the funny thing is, Night Trap was kind of an obscure game to begin with. Like I
Mm.
don't think it was supposed to really grab that much fanfare. Like, I don't think it was supposed to sell that many copies because they were actually using gameplay footage on the Senate committee floor as evidence. Like, they would play it on those old crappy CRT TVs and turn the volume up, and it would show these horrible things of violence that are training people to be violence simulators, which honestly is kind of hilarious that they were playing this on the Senate floor because I've seen some of the footage from that game. It's like the acting is bad because it's supposed to be bad. It's supposed to be a campy B movie. Like seriously, guys, have you seen the villains? They're wearing literal trash bags, literal trash bags.
Literally,
Like
literally.
again,
Oh
like
my.
we'll get to slightly more of that in a second when we kind of give the whole context. But just to let you know, the villains were wearing trash bags.
Yeah,
And I
I
didn't know
mean,
that. And I didn't know that when we were talking about in the second ever episode. And that makes this even better. Going back to
yeah.
it,
I'm really like I was really glad that they covered more about Night Trap. I mean, they cover Mortal Kombat fairly well, and to be open, a lot of the stuff that we covered in our first or second episode of our podcast, rehashed in this documentary. So we did our due diligence pretty well. The thing that we actually didn't cover too much about was Night Trap, and we learned a lot in this episode of the documentary. The man behind Night Trap, Jim Riley, he just
quite the
went
resume.
into yeah, I mean, this is the dude that you want making your special effects. And we can even argue, if we want to, we can even argue that he, without the success of Night Trap, he wouldn't have had the resume that he does. I mean, he did 24. Dude, the special effects dude for 24? Fucking Jack Bauer?
That was cool. That's the rest. That's quite the resume. And then the newer show, Ray Donovan. I haven't seen it yet, but it's always been on my
I
watch
haven't
list.
either.
It's always been on my
Yeah, yeah,
watch
yeah.
list.
Yeah. So to see this man talking about an obscure type of game, and the thing that I think is absolutely hysterical about Night Trap is that this is the result of when you try and like PC or make it protective culture. You try and PC it down because in the documentary, Jim mentions how they wanted it to be, I forget what they wanted it
They did.
to originally,
They
but
didn't want it to be replicatable. Basically, his original vision was like,
ninjas.
yeah,
It was
ninjas.
ninjas with ninja stars. And the executives at Hasbro said, we can't have anything replicatable. Like, what about vampires? He says. What about vampires? We'll have them be vampires. Vampires are great as long as they don't run and they can't bite.
So and they're very slow moving, like very slow moving. Like
Slow moving.
I'm talking like your grandpa like going somewhere in a hurry type of slow moving.
So here's this company trying to protect its customers by saying, hey, we know we don't want people to go out and hurt themselves based off this. So we're going to have, abductors who are vampires who can't run after you. And when they catch you, they can't even suck your blood.
They use this really weird.
So what's the threat?
Hold on, I'm trying to remember what this thing was even called. Let me just look here.
Oh, I also missed what it was.
Well,
I
yeah.
was
So
just baffled.
it's this weird. I'm not joking when I say this because there was really not a name for it. Maybe unless you played the game, but it's like he was saying, we went from ninjas to slow vampires with trash bags for clothing, wielding a blood-sucking drill instrument hook thingy.
Oh yeah,
I'm serious.
weird as fuck. I think that was actually worse.
Like honestly, as an adult looking at this, like with the power of hindsight, but even today, that to me looks far more violent than just having vampires like, B movie suck your blood.
Yeah,
That looks worse. That looks way
yeah,
worse. That looks like some sort of torture device versus
yeah.
vampires.
Looking at it from our perspective now, absolutely. I wouldn't have been playing a game. I might have been playing. If I had been playing a game like that and I saw that, I'd be way more uncomfortable about it. Like the sound effect of the drill, the close up of the drill actually looking like it's going into their neck. They're screaming. No,
I mean,
that's way as
it's
opposed to a vampire, which is, historically and mythologically, it's a story everyone kind of is told. Everyone kind of accepts that, yeah, there might be a dude out there who transforms into a bat, and during the night, mostly on Halloween, he might come and suck your blood. Like, everyone knows what a vampire is, but what the fuck are these things with the neck chain that suck? Oh, like what the fuck?
And that's the thing. The vampires that people were used to were the Bram Stoker, vampires. It's like, yeah, sure, it's scary. Yeah, sure, there was the movie, but it like this was the early '90s. Like there wasn't any other
Yeah.
like vampire show to make vampires look really scary or anything. Like that's the thing. By trying to PC this game from ninjas to these really weird, slow vampires with these really weird blood sucking drill instruments, they made it worse. Had they just, I'm not saying they had to stick with ninjas, but had they just done something like vampires, it wouldn't have gotten the flack that it had. So his vision was basically ruined. His vision went from being this one great idea where you're looking at the game from 6 different camera angles trying to protect the people in the
Mm.
house. Oh, and that's the other point in the game. Your ultimate goal is protecting the teenage kids from the attackers, but of course the senators weren't interested in learning the actual truth. They took scenes from the game out of context in the hearings, which again, no
Oh yeah,
surprise.
yeah.
But the point of the game was you're looking at 6 different images of like,
They're like security cameras. They wanted to have you pick between each camera, and based off of each camera, it would be where the story was driven. So you were really in charge of it. I found that really innovative too. Yeah.
especially in the early '90s, that was crazy innovative. It was
Oh
like
yeah.
really forward thinking as far as an idea. Like that would come to kind of set the tone for future games and decisions and just interactivity, and it was great for that. The game started off with a budget of 1.5 million that went through basically a production hell. They started off with it being sky's the limit, like I said, with the one guy and what he wanted to create. But then it became a campy B-level movie, which whatever. And the project ultimately, even though Hasbro was like yes to these trash bag villains and all that, it was
Yeah.
canned until Sega came along with their Sega CD system to rescue it, so that way they can
Yeah.
push this game to teens on their platform. And the Sega CD was a garbage system, and the only ever good game on that was Sonic CD. Again, that could be a future episode, but for now, that's what they did. They took something completely out of context that was a stripped down version from what it really was, and they went to town
And they
with it.
ruined it.
And they
Yeah.
went, they ruined it, and they went to town on it in the Senate. All that did was 2 things. It created the modern day ESRB rating system that you see on every video game, and it made both Night Trap and Mortal Kombat far more popular than it would be. Mortal Kombat was already going to be popular, but this just made it more popular. And Night Trap, it probably would have faded away into obscurity because of just the
Yeah.
nature of it. But because of that, now everybody wanted to play it, because if you tell people not to play something, especially as a kid, they're going to do the exact opposite. And today,
Which is
sorry, the last thing I was going to say, and today it's been re-released on Nintendo Switch. So what does that tell you? Everything you need to know.
well, yeah. It tells me that the more you try and control something, the more out of control the situation gets.
And that's what you get for telling people that they can't play something and not doing your due diligence. This is what
Yep.
happens.
This is what happened.
Well, I think there's one more guy we have to talk about. That one gamer. Takahiro Nakano.
So Nakano's story really is something that we all kind of face, where we are passionate about something, and once we realize its potential, we kind of get relocated into the norms of life. Something that really shined through for me was that he built up his prowess as a fighting game competitor through a friend of his in school. He would go to the arcade after school. His buddy would let him play for free, and he got to develop a reputation amongst himself. He pretty much defeated everyone in his community, including his friend who let him play for free. And he said, "You know, I'm really good at this. Let me try my stake at the national." He ended up going into a Street Fighter competition. He ended up winning. That was the day that he knew that he was good at that. But after that victory, he was really satisfied in a sense. So he took up a job in sales.
It looked soul crushing. Just real quick, he was so good at Street Fighter in that tournament. He said in the final match the competitor couldn't land a single hit on him. I think he said he had to use like allowance money to go all the way to Tokyo to fight in this tournament, kind of because he realized that he was far better than everybody else in his town. And it's like you said, it was so cool that he did this. He won the tournament, just like the documentary did in the last episode as far as the visuals. He went from being on top of the world Street Fighter champion in 1993 to he ended up working a boring office job, phones ringing, sales, going around stamping stuff, stapling stuff, delivering mail. And I'm like, oh, it's like Office Space, but but this is for real, just like for everybody else.
Yep.
And you feel bad because you remember that being a kid where you play all these games, you have a good time, and you think sky's the limit, and then you go doing your career basically, and it's, oh boy, this is it. Well, let's keep working at it and make some money. And he ended up saying something to the tune of something that I wrote down here. Some people have the, so I'm paraphrasing here. Some people have the job drive or desire to climb the corporate ladder. He did not understand that desire one bit, according to what he said. Because some people are go-getters and do it, and he just wasn't about that life. And I can definitely understand what he's getting at, because for some people, it's you go to work, you get paid, and you use that money to do things that you personally want to do, whether that's play video games, go travel.
Yeah, me too.
Doesn't matter. Something that you enjoy. You work to live. But fortunately for him, the esports scene came knocking.
It's funny because he found himself in a situation, and his background was known to his employers. Imagine just being at that soul-crushing dead end job, and all of a sudden your boss saying, "We want you to head a project, and we want you to play video games every day starting tomorrow, and we want you to train and get a competitive esports team together." Being in the situation that he was, a responsible adult, thought, well, this is my passion. This is what I'm good at. This is finally a time that I can utilize that strength. So obviously took the gig.
With 2 words, I'm in.
That's all you need to say.
And he looked for those with inherent talent and trained from there. And he took something that adults told their kids, get a real job. Well, who's laughing now? These kids are now making money to the bank. As far as esports goes, it now rivals real sports in terms of money made and the audience. And I may not fully get it myself. I'm not sitting here watching esports teams play. I'm not interested in that at all, but I will not criticize it all. It is part of our changing media in this ever-changing world. And just because I don't understand it or find it entertaining doesn't mean there isn't an audience for it. And I recognize that. I don't have to fully invest in something to understand the potential.
I also feel sort of similar. I feel like there is definitely, as I've said previously on this podcast, there is an art form to video games. To be good at them is to be skilled at something. Call it sports is where I kind of draw my line, because sports has mostly been physical, exhausting feats of strength or cooperation, but accumulatively working in reality. Like football, soccer is very popular amongst the world, but it's an endurance kind of thing. You train, you practice, you go out, you get your friends together. A game of soccer is a lot of fun. Playing online soccer, I would argue, is fun, but I really think that they would have more fun if they were actually playing soccer.
I mean, and that's where I'm going to kind of agree with you as well. That's what I mean. I don't fully understand it myself,
Yeah,
but it is an ever-changing landscape. I would technically call it a sport in that it is, 2 people competing against each other or 2 teams competing against each other for a prize or street cred,
sure,
what have
sure.
you. So, in that sense, yes, it's not your, competitive sports of actually going out and playing football versus playing Madden, or actually going out and playing football or soccer versus playing
Hmm.
FIFA, or playing, MVP baseball versus real baseball. But it is a competition between 2 sides, and there can only be one victor. So, in that sense, I buy it as a sport, even if I don't find it entertaining the same way that a lot of people might do.
Yeah. And let us know, PinPoint players, if there's a particular way that you feel about esports. If you feel like it's an up and coming, emerging, competitive sport, send us a message.
However, you
Yeah,
can.
contact us through our email, pinpointplayers@gmail.com. You can also reach us on our Instagram @pinpointplayers. But you can also find us on your local Spotify or podcasting service. We are available on most podcasting services.
And with that, another complete episode about the fighting experience and the controversy that was the early 90s with the video
And violence,
games.
yeah.
I did, again, get excited when I saw the preview for episode 6,
Mm-hmm.
and it brought a smile to my face when I saw Doom, the opening graphic, because I played it on PS1 and I saw that every single time the game loaded, and so I was excited to see. For me, will be another exciting episode, because it's funny talking about violent video games and the concern that parents have about what their kids are playing. So it's funny that for me, I got to play Doom as a kid because I'm guessing my parents didn't pay too much to those Senate hearings, and I'm kind of glad. Or maybe they did and they just don't care. So either way, thanks, Mom and Dad, because I got to play Doom and have a good time. Until the GTA 3 days, but I told you that. I think I mentioned that story to the Pinpoint players in episode
Oh,
one or
sure.
two. But anyway, like the preview, excited for episode 6, the final
This is
episode.
our this is the second to last episode before our second season finale. What a time it's been! We want to thank all the Pinpoint players for continuing to support us by listening through your chosen podcasting platform. We want to let you know that we've got a host of really engaging material for our third season, and we hope that you tune in and stick around for that.
Yep. And with that,
If you want to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, that'll help us with outreach. If you want to follow us on Spotify, that'll help get our podcast into the video game category. And if you enjoy listening to what we have to say, share our content with your friends and family.
couldn't have said any better. Thank you all for listening to episode 5, and we'll be back next time with the 6th and final episode of Highscore.
Stay tuned and take it easy, Pinpoint players.